got a great guest today. She's author DeAnn Lubell, a local gal, and we will be talking to her about her new novel, The Last Moon. DeAnn has written for Palm Springs Life magazine, The Desert Sun, and Desert magazine, and her published works include a novelette and historic and educational books for little folks' visuals. She is a publicist and development consultant for a number of nonprofit organizations, including, among many others, Angel View, Crippled Children's Foundation, the Friends of the Rancho Mirage Library, Palm Springs Women in Film and Television. She's a member of and has served as president of the National League of American Pen Women in both Boca Raton and the Palm Springs chapters. She is a resident, and she served as president. That's the most important thing, and she's a resident of Rancho Mirage, California. DeAnn, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We're going to start off by talking to her, as I said, about her book, but at the final segment, she's going to change hats and talk about some of the things coming up with the organizations that she represents. DeAnn, I want you to start off, if you would, please, by first giving our listeners your website, your website, and then I'd like you to go on with an overview of the book.
Okay, be my pleasure. The website is www.thelastmoon1902.com. And the book is a historical novel based on the actual events taking place prior to and after the 1902 eruption of Mount Pelée on the island of Martinique.
Well, and it's quite a story, and I know this story has inspired you for many years. Let's start off by with the question, how and when did you first hear of it?
I was a college student, and I read a lot while I was studying, and I came across a book that documented the happenings of this historical time. And it fascinated me so much by the time I was through reading the book and reading about the people who actually existed at the time, that I made a promise to myself that one day I would write a historical novel based on the facts, but I wouldn't write it until I'd actually step foot on the island to do firsthand research.
Well, and you were in college when you first heard about it, didn't you? So
Yep.
This has been something that you've been living with. I mean, it's an amazing story, but even more extraordinary is something that happened when you and your husband were living in Boca Raton. And give my listeners those amazing details. What happened?
Yeah, this is a good one. This is a good one. When I read about the history of St. Pierre, I also read about a gentleman who lived at the time by the name of Fernand Clerk, and he was running for an office. He was also an amateur volcanologist, and his story and many others captured my attention. So fast forward probably 20 years later, and my husband and I were living in Boca Raton, and we were selling our house on our own. And a gentleman came in to view the house. He liked it. He says, "May I bring my friend back with me tomorrow to get his opinion?" He came back the next day with this gentleman with a very thick French accent. My husband went off with the prospective buyer, and I was left with this gentleman who I assumed was from France. And when I asked him where from France he was from, he said, "No, I'm from Martinique." And then I went into the saga of my story, telling him how I discovered the story, talking about Fernand Clerk, how I swore I wouldn't write anything until I'd actually step foot on the island. And he shushed me after a while and said, "Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Yves Clerk. Fernand was my grandfather." So the man that I had read about all those years before, his grandson was now standing in my living room.
What was your immediate reaction?
I passed out.
I would imagine so. What are the odds of that? The odds are extraordinary as well, but it was meant to be, obviously. Let's now, you mentioned the date of the eruption of Mount Pelée, is it? Mm-hmm. mention that again. And do you know how many people in the coastal city of St. Pierre died?
I do. This happened in 1902, May 8th to be exact. And at the time of the eruption, the city had swollen in size to around 30,000 people. So the estimate is around 30,000 perished within 3 to 4 minutes of this particular eruption, which was a pyroclastic eruption. Very, very similar to the Mount St. Helens eruption.
Could you describe a little more what you mean by that, that term?
Yes. The pressure in the mountain builds and builds and builds. Preceding this, there can be earthquakes, there can be cracks in the mountain that will allow lava or mud flows to come out, sometimes flowing as high as 100 feet in height. In this particular case, tidal waves were caused by the mud flows, so this poor little town really took a beating. When the pressure in the volcano built so high, it literally blew a hole in the side of the mountain, and it is as they called, an avalanche, a fire avalanche propelled by hot gases. Then it can travel up to 100 to 400 miles an hour once it gets rolling.
Had there been any other recorded instances of volcanic eruptions on the island prior to that?
About 50 years before, it spewed some ash, stirred to life, and went back to sleep, which is what the people of the island at the time of the 1902 eruption thought would happen. And there were elections going on at the time, and part of the story, the intrigue of this particular story, is the fact that the French government were so keen on keeping these elections going and not wanting anything to interrupt them that they falsified scientific reports to lead the people of the area to feel safe.
Well, we're going to talk about that a little more, too. However, for those of my listeners that are just tuning in, this is the Jacqueline Bachar Show, and I'm talking to our local author, DeAnn Lubell, about her new novel, The Last Moon. And she's giving, as you hopefully heard, some really amazing details. That was going to be my next question, that the shocking part of that event was that it wasn't just nature solely to blame. There was corruption and greed among many inhabitants that added to the destruction. So why don't you continue talking about that? You touched on it briefly. So can you go into a little more detail as to who else, what did they actually do? In addition to falsifying these reports, what did they do when things first started bubbling? Did they just ignore it?
They justified it. They justified it by saying it's reacting the same way as it did 50 years prior, which again gave the residents some false hope. But because these elections were so important, especially to the French government at the time, that they didn't want anything to interrupt them. So they sent a scientific team out, and the team claimed it actually went to the volcano. I think they went to the nearest restaurant and then made the report up afterwards.
Yeah. Again, for those who are not familiar with the island of Martinique, where is it located?
It is a windward island in the Lesser Antilles. It's closer to the tip of South America. It's an island that's about 435 square miles in circumference and about 50 miles long and 22 miles wide. The reason I say this is a lot of people wonder, because the volcano only destroyed a very small portion of the island, why did the rest of the island stay intact? Well, it's because it's a very long island, 50 miles long, and this was at the northern part.
Does that city exist today?
Yes, it does.
Okay. What is the capital of Martinique? Do you remember? I've been to Martinique.
Port-au-Prince. Port-au-Prince.
Is it still French owned?
Yes, it is. It is to this day. And I've actually went to the island after I met Mr. Clerk in my house. About 3 or 4 months later, my husband and I were the guest of the Clerks, where we spent 2 weeks, and I did research, and it was wonderful. I met the island historian, who provided me with a wealth of information, and I actually got to interview an eyewitness to the eruption. He was 90 years old when I met him, and 5 when he saw the eruption.
Well, and again, we want to save a little more of that aspect of it too for a little later. But I do want to talk about, first of all, the story is a complicated story. It's about politics, greed, corruption, history, language, racial intolerance, societal classes. My goodness, it sounds like modern day. But describe your process in first developing the story, because this has been boiling in your heart and soul for a long time. So what did you do early on in the process? And then a little bit later, we're going to get to the question about what you did when you got there.
Well, let me put it this way. The fabric of the story was already there. This actually happened. What I did was I followed along the timeline of the events leading up to the eruption. I used most all the actual people who existed at the time, and then I added a few of my own characters who were actually composites of people who lived there.
Yes, because we want to emphasize this is based on fact, but it is a fictionalized, it's a novel. And so your creative aspect entered into it. But obviously you did have to do a lot of historical research. Did you do a lot of reading about the subject, or was there not much out there?
I did tremendous. Like I said, I went to the island. The island historian provided me with just a gold mine of information. And also they suggested that I find 2 books. One was called 2 Years in the West Indies, and it was published in 1886, I believe. And it was really my Bible to this story, because it in detail described every aspect of the island, the people, what the women looked like, what they wore, what they ate, the description of the buildings. And then I came back with actual before and after photographs. So I was able to look at these photographs, study them, and everything I put in that book, 96% of it is based on fact.
Well, and so it's a true story. That's the thing that your readers have to understand. That yes, it's fictionalized, but it is a true story.
Like I said, I had the fabric was there. I just used my own thread to kind of brighten it up a little bit with my characters and a few outside situations.
Now, how long did you actually spend in writing it once you started? Now, had you done any writing early on in college, or did you do any? Say to yourself, "I'm going to sit down and write a chapter today. What I think this should be about," or did it just kind of gel until this meeting that you had?
I actually stuck to my word that I wouldn't write anything until I had gone to the island. But having said that, I read everything I could find on the incident and had different opinions.
What was the most important aspect of that visit? And that's a tough question, I know.
I think setting foot on ground, number one. And of course, when I first got sight of St. Pierre and Mount Pelée, and it was overwhelming. That's all I can say. It was just overwhelming to actually be there and see it for myself.
Absolutely. It sounds like it was almost a spiritual trip.
It was. It really was. The Clerks have a nephew by the name of Alan Clerk, and Alan was so nice to take my husband and I in his Jeep every day to all the ruins, to all the sites, and I'll never forget, we were standing at the ruin of the theater at the time, and I was pointing out, okay, over there that happened, over there that happened, blah blah blah, and Alan turned to me and he said, "You know, Deanne, you know more about what happened than most of us." He says, "We have elections for mayor next year. I think you ought to come back and run." So I had read so much, studied so much. By the time I got there, I had a map in my mind of where everything was, and it was placed just exactly where I knew it would be.
Yeah, and that aspect is amazing, I think. The fact that you have the picture in your mind, and you've probably seen pictures of Martinique and everything else, but to be on the actual island and have that feeling of familiarity must have been incredible. Talk about some of the people that you met there. Again, you touched on it briefly, but let's go into some more details about some of the people that helped you with your research and stories of things that went on and what life is like there. And you actually had to get into a little bit of study about the Creole language as well. So I think that's an interesting fact, learning the Creole language. How did that develop?
The Creole language came about, of course, the island is a French-owned island, so French is the predominant language. But when you bring in all the aspects during the heyday of the shipping era, you had a mixture of Dutch and Spanish and English and all these dialects, and they just evolved into what they call Creole or Patois.
Like in Louisiana,
exactly.
The same aspect.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what was interesting, one of the most interesting, of course, voodoo is practiced on this island. And there was a folklore prior to me coming, and I couldn't understand when we got there why a lot of people were very standoffish and quite nervous around me, and I thought, geez, what's wrong with me? And I later found out that there was an old folklore that a tall blonde lady who was not from the island, which would come to visit, and when she did, the volcano would blow again.
Oh dear. No wonder they were nervous. How did you feel when you heard that?
I wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms right away.
Yes.
But they eventually warmed up to me, and the hospitality was wonderful. And I think one of my best experiences was going to meet with Marie Chamereau, who was the island historian, actually still is the island historian. And she was so taken with me and my passion for the story that she said when my first draft of the manuscript was done, she'd like to take a look at it, which of course was fine. And so many years later that did happen, and she's also an accomplished fine artist, and she was so kind to do 6 etchings from my book, scenes from my book that are actually in the book. So the artwork in the book was presented to me by the island historian for that use. She was wonderful.
That is marvelous. What about the things that we talked about, the societal classes and so forth? I think that still exists somewhat on the island of Martinique, the political situation and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, like in our politics, you have the conservatives and you have the liberals, and at that time, the whites were a minority, and your blacks and your mulattoes were the majority, and your wealth came from the white French plantation owners and business owners on the island. And the whites had always had control politically, but there was a man by the name of Amity Knight who is a black man who was actually educated in Paris. And when he came back to the island, does this parallel our own culture right now? But when he came back to the island, his popularity was so high, even with some of the whites, that the voting started to lean towards him. And that's when the government decided that they couldn't take a chance to disrupt the momentum of the voters and lose that, and that's why they did what they did, to falsify the documentation to make everybody feel safe until after the election.
Mm-hmm. But what about present time?
Present time, well, actually when we were there was an uprising.
There was.
Mm-hmm.
And
there was guards and soldiers with machine guns on every corner. Oh yeah, we hit it at a real good time.
Yeah. Well, what was that all about?
Rights. Rights and protests, and that's usually what it is all about.
And of course that's happening in France. France is feeling the effects of ethnicity, and unfortunately the French have a history of kind of pushing certain groups out in the suburbs or out in not so nice places, and that's what's happening in Paris too. A lot of these people are so far out in the suburbs, there's no work for them, and they've had riots. They were burning cars. I was there when they were doing that too. So I don't know, there's something about the French. As much as we love them, there is something about that kind of generates that reaction. How long did that last?
When we were there?
Yes, when you were there.
Oh, I think that was it was like a coup for maybe a month. Yeah. I don't think it lasted that long.
They weren't trying to overthrow the government, though, were they?
They were. The government was pretty worried. Like I said, the soldiers were there with the machine guns when we were there.
Yeah, those are interesting periods in the Caribbean and other places. That I had that happen when I was in Venezuela years back. I didn't like that very much. I can understand why you didn't.
It was like I was there. My dream had come true, and I didn't care if there was an army there doing whatever. I was just happy to be there. And another interesting point when we were there, and a lot of people ask me this, is what does it look like now? And they didn't really rebuild. They kept those ruins as a monument to those who were lost.
Yes, that makes sense. Yes.
Yeah. So the ruins are there, and left untouched.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit now about, and I am talking to DeAnn Lubell, our wonderful local author, who has written a historical novel called The Last Moon. And it's all about Martinique, this beautiful island in the Caribbean, and the horrible things that happened, and some of the real characters that lived at that time that she's incorporated into her book. So let's talk at this point about that. It is a fictionalized version of events with fictionalized characters, but there are some real-life people that you've included in it, and then others are based on real-life people that you've fictionalized. We don't want to give the story away, but we certainly want people to pick up this book and be attracted by the beautiful cover, this wonderful illustration that the historian did. But let's give them a little taste of what's inside.
Okay. You want me to talk about the characters?
Talk about the characters.
Okay. Well, we have two mulatto women. One was, and during that time, it was not unusual for the white plantation owners to have a second family tucked away somewhere, and usually with their black mistress or mulatto mistress.
Sounds like our South in the old days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a white plantation owner, Marcel, and his wife. I'm not going to give too much away,
right.
But she, let's just say that she created a path that opened up doors for some people and closed doors for others, and caused happiness in some cases and absolutely total grief in others.
Well, that's a wonderful hook to get people inside of the book, of the story. That's enticing, I think.
Thank you. And this left Marcel, the plantation owner, free to marry his mulatto lady and bring their child into a home, which, again, it was good and bad, but this was all leading up to the eruption. Marcel has a son by the name of Andre. And again, not going into too much detail, but I can say that Andre, outside of Yvette, which is the mulatto daughter of Marcel, who's a very strong, wonderful female character, but Andre is just so bad that I'm afraid I've hit quite a raw nerve in a lot of people when they read about him.
That is great. When that happens, you know you've done the right thing. Just quickly talk about that.
I was in a situation when I overheard 3 people who had read the book. They thought they were at a distance from me, but they didn't know that I could actually hear them. Of course, one said, well, what did you think of Deanne's book? And of course, then I really did lean over to hear. And someone said, oh, I loved it, but that character, Andre, he is so vile, he's so evil, he's so bad. And someone else said, I agree, he is the worst person. and I'm thinking to myself, he's not live. The poor guy, if he was alive and come through the door about that time, there would have been a lynch mob, I tell you.
That's great. That's great. Very quickly, because we're going to be out of time pretty soon, I want to ask you a very important question. And what has it meant to you to be able to tell this story?
The number one thing, and I've been carrying this for a long time, since I was 18 years old, is I feel that I have finally given 30,000 people a voice who died needlessly in this disaster.
Well, that's pretty good. I would say you certainly have done that.
Yeah.
And also, I would assume that it's just, besides, and that's a very important reason, of course, but this is something that you have been thinking about your whole life, and suddenly, not suddenly, but it did happen suddenly in your home in Florida. Suddenly, there it was, and now it's complete.
And now it's complete. It's a dream come true.
Yes.
I know that's an overused statement, but it's true. It's a dream come true. I'm very pleased with the book, and the reviews I've been receiving have been favorable, and people are enjoying it. And
people can go online also and read the reviews. I mean, we want them to get the book and naturally and read the book. But mention your website again very quickly.
www.thelastmoon1902.com.
And get some more teasers. Well, we are out of time, Deanne. I can't believe how quickly time goes by with something as fascinating as this story. Thank you so much for being with us. Best of luck with the book.